Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Verno. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about performance reviews and specifically how to deliver a performance review that inspires action. This really is a replay in some regards off of a LinkedIn audio that I did a few days ago that we lost the microphone connection about 2/3 of the way through. So I decided I'm just going to do a podcast on this. We're going to talk about a few different things. One is I'm going to provide you some of the survey data that looks at what are the challenges that employees face or think about when they're having to do the performance reviews, because I think that's most important. And what I mean by that is that they're the ones that are the receivers of this. And I think oftentimes performance management is a process that seems very one-sided, that employees are having this done to them rather than done with them. And I think that needs to change. If we really want to make these things effective and not just a check the box exercise that needs to be done, there's an opportunity here to really turn these into something valuable. And that's what I put together here, is an opportunity to really revisit and look at how do we do this? How do we create something that really inspires employees to become better? And I would say both of us want that, right? If I'm the manager or leader of this individual, I want them to get better. And I believe that for the most part, people themselves want to get better. At least that's the belief I'm going to go with on this. So with that said, what am I going to cover? Well, first, what I'm going to review is some of the survey data that's out there to identify what are the challenges that people are facing. Then we're going to talk about some social needs that directly impact those challenges, and I'll sort of trace back in terms of how those social needs do that. And then we're going to talk about a model that I use regularly in all of my work. It's a model that I created called Cables, and it's about behaviors that build better bridges. And think about your performance reviews as individual bridges with the people that are on the receiving end of this, or hopefully we're going to look at this now on the collaborative end of this, how we're going to do this. And then last thing, I'm going to review a model that I find a great value in. It's called the 4DX model, 4 Disciplines of Execution. I actually, not that long ago, interviewed one of the authors of that, Jim Hewling, of the book, and I will tell you, I think it's a fabulous model. I use it myself. I'll describe how you can use it, I think, in performance management as well going forward. Also, I'm going to challenge you, if you haven't already had a chance to try it out, is using ChatGPT. I think that is such an aid to your ability to lead and manage more effectively. And if you haven't had an opportunity to yet, I'm going to challenge you to do that, because if you fight this, I promise you, you're not going to be as good a leader as you could be without this. It will provide you, I think, value in ways that you can't even understand at this point. And that's how I felt when I first started using it back in January. And I will tell you, I use it with all of my clients now. It's an incredible tool. So again, ChatGPT. Let's get started. What are some of the challenges that employees are facing? Well, I listed 10 of them. And I did a Google search, as well as I used chat to ask it based on surveys and what research was out there. What were the greatest challenges? I'll list them now. So the first one was lack of objectivity, meaning employees perceived performance reviews as subjective and that they had personal biases. And I would agree with that, right? Oftentimes that's the case. That they were infrequent. Annual performance reviews, they don't provide timely feedback. And that's meaning that we can't just do something, at the end of the year as a follow-up to what we did the year before. So I'm going to be as bold as to say, if you're only looking at performance reviews once during the year, sort of in month 11, to go over what was agreed to 11 months ago for this year, you're wasting your time. If you review it at 6 months, I think you're wasting your time. And if you review it at 3 months or quarterly, I would still argue that you're wasting your time, or at the very least, you're not really being as effective as you could be with this tool. And I know many of you might be thinking, well, boy, that's going to take a lot more time to do that. And I think it's counterintuitive that actually more touches on performance reviews will take less time in the long run because it's just a working document at that point. I'll give you this analogy. If we were on the west coast of the U.S. or on the east coast of the U.S., and I said, I'm gonna drive to Lake Tahoe. I'm gonna point my car in the direction of Lake Tahoe, and I'm gonna drive. And let's just say I could drive. It's gonna take me 12 days to get there. I'm gonna drive for 11 days straight. I've already pointed my car in the right direction. I'm just going. If I don't get out of my car or check where I am until the 11th day, what is the likelihood that I land in Lake Tahoe on day 12? Probably not that great. If I were to drive my car and not get out for 6 days, again, probably not that great. Better, but not that great. And if I did it in 3 days, still better than 6, certainly better than 11, but it's still requiring more work because who knows what could have happened. And now I have to recorrect because maybe I was off by just a little bit. And to me, that's the same thing with performance reviews. If we are not regularly setting up meetings where we have just laser meetings on these, could be 10 minutes, just check-ins to see where we are in terms of what we have identified as our areas of performance over the year, then we're wasting time. We're not as efficient as we could be. Number 3 in the challenges, focusing on negatives, right? Employees feel that their performance reviews are disproportionately focused on the negatives. And this isn't to say that we simply create a trophy for everybody and we only talk about the good stuff. But if we focus just on the negative, we're not really going to end up in a good place. And there's a lot of research that backs up why that happens. So inconsistency is the next one. That was number 4. When we have review processes that there aren't clear standards or expectations, we run into problems. One-way communication is number 5, right? And if you think about traditional performance reviews, they are often one-sided. It is a one-sided conversation. It's me telling you how your performance was, and maybe you get to add some comments after, but I have control over this thing if I'm your manager. And we know that doesn't work. Insufficient guidance, right? The employee gets the performance review, and again, there's a lack of expectations or clear direction as to where they're going to go. Number 7 on this was around anxiety and stress. And I think just the anticipation for some people creates an environment where they just don't want to do this, and probably creates anxiety and stress for the manager or the person that has to do it as well at times. They're time consuming, that both the manager and the employee feels that oftentimes like they're cramming for an exam at the end. And this sort of goes in somewhat of contrast or conflict to that infrequency challenge that was talked about earlier. And again, I think it's about efficiency here. Employees want to know on a more regular basis how they're doing. And I think it can be done in a faster and more efficient way. That's really what we're talking about. The next one, number 9, is the perceived impact that it might have on their career progression. And again, employees worry about this. How is this performance review going to impact my ability to move throughout the company? And then lastly, there's a disconnect from the actual performance. And this is where I think an employee and a manager, if they wait too long especially, all of a sudden it's like, I did all these great things and none of them are reflected in my performance review. All you've noticed here is what I'm not doing, but you haven't cited any of the things that I am doing. So those are the challenges. Well, now what do we do about that? Well, there's a model, again, that I use quite regularly, and it's all around identifying 5 social needs that we all have. And it was created by a neuroscientist named David Rock out of Australia, and it has an acronym called SCARF. And SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So the first one, status, refers to an individual's perceived performance or rank within the group. And again, this to me really comes down to, do I feel appreciated? Do I feel valued? Is what I say recognized here, right? When we don't have status, we create an environment where people become disengaged, right? There's with this model, there's either a reward or avoid response. So when these social needs that I'm going to discuss are met, are satisfied, then it's a reward response. People become more engaged, more collaborative. When they are missing, when they're neglected, then employees become more disengaged, less collaborative, and probably at times can become more disruptive as a way of demonstrating their frustration. So the next one in the SCARF model is around certainty, and it represents really an employee's need for predictability and clarity in regards to the environment that they're in, right? So we can think about that from many of the challenges that we talked about. The next one is around autonomy, and it involves the perception of control over one's own environment, their decisions, their actions. Again, it's not to say that we all get to just show up and do whatever we want when we get to work, right? We have job descriptions and roles that we need to perform, but people still want to feel as though they have some control over their place. The next is around relatedness, right? It's concern for a sense of connection or belonging in terms of the group, social network, and also a connection to the person that I'm reporting to. And the stronger that connection is, the more trust we build, the more collaboration we tend to encourage when we do have a sense of relatedness. And then lastly, we talk about fairness. And that relates to the perception of equitable treatment and sort of the distribution of resources within a social context. And what does that really mean? It just means that I want to feel as though it's the same rules that apply to all of us here. Some people don't get better treatment or get to do more things than anybody else here based on how we operate. But when that does happen, if I feel like, somebody gets preferential treatment or their reviews are easier or what they're recognized for is nothing special to what anybody else does, but they always get sort of high marks for it, we're going to be dealing with a place of people feeling as though there's a lack of fairness here. So how do these translate back to those 10 challenges? Well, if we talk about lack of objectivity, fairness comes into play, right? Employees perceive the evaluation process as being unfair. It's not the same for everybody. Infrequency. Certainty comes into play there, right? When there are infrequent reviews, it causes an uncertainty about how am I doing in terms of performance? I don't know. When we focus on negatives, again, that impacts us in regards to status because it reflects on my worth or how I'm recognized here. The next one is around inconsistency, and that deals with a couple of those SCARF domains. One is around fairness, right? Inconsistency can activate a sense of unfairness, but it also can do that in the sense of certainty when we don't feel as though we understand what the rules of the road are. The next one is around that one-way communication, and that impacts us in regards to autonomy. If I feel like I'm not given a chance to voice my concerns or opinions, also it affects relatedness, that it's a one-sided conversation, and I don't feel as though there's a real connection between us. When we talk about anxiety and stress, again, we talk about certainty and status that can come into play there. When we talk about a time-consuming process, we can reflect back on autonomy there, that I feel like I'm being forced to do something right now, and I don't have a choice to do this. It's taking away from other things that I might need to be doing. The next one, number 9, is perceived impact on career progression. So status comes into play there, right? Especially if it's a negative performance review. We're thinking about what does this do for me in terms of the status or my growth trajectory within the organization. And then the next is certainty as it relates to that impact on career progression. The next one we talk about is a disconnect from actual performance. And that deals with a couple of the SCARF models or domains. One is around fairness, right? There's a disconnect in the review process between what my actual performance is and what you're identifying as my overall performance is. And then status. Again, I feel as though I'm not appreciated. You've mentioned a number of things, but you haven't really highlighted a lot of the things that I have been doing this whole time. And one of the things that I think can often come into play here is a term called recency and latency. And when we have recency and latency, we tend to recall what's happened in the present, and we forget about those things that are further back, right? So we remember the things that happened most recently. We forget about the things that have happened a ways back. That can work against an employee or for an employee. If I did a lot of great things in the beginning of the year and maybe I'm in a slump right now. Things aren't going as well. My review could be weighted heavily toward my slump, even though for the majority of this year, I've been doing a lot of positive things. And the reverse can also play out, is that I could have been a dud the beginning of the year, and I somehow just got it together in the last quarter. And that's what tends to get weighted more or remembered more. And if we think about this for other people around, if that's to happen, then fairness could come into play as well for other people. And they're like, wait a minute, this person didn't do anything all year long, but now they're getting recognized for just what's happened now. So after we've identified the SCARF model, the social needs that need to be addressed, the next thing we can do is we can look at what are the behaviors that can create a better performance review experience. What are the things that we can do? Well, there's a model that I use regularly. It's called Cables. And this is where that idea of a bridge comes into play, is that if you imagine each of the relationships you have with somebody on your team is an individual bridge, then what you're doing is you're trying to make this bridge stronger. And the only way that becomes stronger is by developing and modeling consistently positive behaviors. So as an acronym, I created Cables, which the 6 letters of Cables each represents one of those behaviors, again, that's been researched that improves the strength of that relationship bridge that you have. So the first one is congruence, and it's about walking the talk. Is what I say and what I do in alignment? And if it's not, if what I say and what I do is not in alignment, then we start to break down that bridge. The next one is around appreciation. It's 2 parts, really. It's about recognizing individuals for what they do and also recognizing individuals for who they are, their uniqueness, their individuality, right? Their diversity. The next, we talk about belongingness, and this is about creating or behaving in a way that creates a sense of inclusion, relatedness. Do I feel like I'm part of this group or part of this team? And oftentimes that's the responsibility of the leader to create that sense of environment. The next is around listening. And I talk about listening in 4 different components. I say that to really listen to somebody effectively requires us to listen on 4 different levels. One is we listen with our eyes, and that's we watch for body language, facial expressions to see if those things are in alignment. We listen then with our ears, where we're listening for tone of voice, the speed at which somebody speaks, maybe the word choice that they use. And then next we're listening with our mind, and that's about listening from the standpoint of curiosity, is where we're listening for really trying to make sure that we understand what the other person is trying to say. And that oftentimes requires us to ask clarifying questions to make sure that we understand that what the person is saying and how I'm interpreting it is the same thing. And then lastly, we talk about listening with the heart or listening with empathy. And that's about listening in a way that if the roles were reversed, how would I want this person to be listening to me? And certainly this is an appropriate place to practice all 4 of those when we're in a performance review. So the next behavior that we talk about is empathy, and that stands by itself. And we can think about the process of performance management as a whole. And maybe we can reflect back on times that we were the employee and maybe times that we were uncomfortable in performance reviews, or imagining how would we want to be treated if we were the employee here? How would we want this to go? And that's the empathy part. And then the last behavior that we talk about is specifics, and that's about clear expectations. And what we're looking for there is really, does everybody understand what the expectations are? What are the clear expectations? And also, do we hold each other accountable to what those expectations are? In organizations, I will tell you, when I often have to go in and deal with teams that are in conflict or individuals that are in conflict, oftentimes we can identify not having clear expectations as one of the root causes. So let's circle back to those 10 challenges that we talked about, right? So the first one, lack of objectivity. From a behavior standpoint, both congruence and specifics can be very valuable here, right? If we talk about the infrequency that might be involved with performance reviews, we can look at specifics in terms of scheduling more frequent check-ins with the employee so that they know, right, how often we're going to be meeting. Listening can be important here too, right? Regularly engaging in a two-way communication with the employee to ensure that we are on the same page here. Next, focusing on the negatives. Appreciation can come into play here, is that we're recognizing and celebrating employees' strengths and their achievements, and that we balance that feedback. It's not to say that we're going to give everybody a trophy or we're just going to try and coddle people, but it's just trying to recognize, what are the social needs and what are the behaviors that can address those. And the other one in regards to that is empathy, is that we think of what it would be like. How would I want this to be delivered if I was on the other side of this performance review? The next one is around inconsistency. Well, that was one of the challenges, right? So again, we're about congruence. Standardizing things can work there. And then specifics. So next, we talk about the one-way communication. And this is where listening, again, can come into play, where when people feel as though they're truly being listened to, you can only do that if you're giving people a chance to speak. And then empathy, right? That you validate the other person, right? Whatever they're feeling, or you demonstrate an understanding for their point of view can be really important and necessary in this situation. Insufficient guidance, where again, specifics can come into play to clearly communicate expectations, but listening can come into play here too in terms of ensuring that you understand the questions and concerns that employees have so that you can address those. When we talk about anxiety and stress that employees might be feeling, well, empathy is an important one here for obvious reasons. Imagining, times that we might have been uncomfortable in this situation. And then also to help people along it's to create that feeling of belongingness with individuals. So we pull on relatedness there. And again, this belief that, or trying to make this feeling that this performance review, we're both involved in this, that it's a collaborative process that we're going through. This is not just something that I'm dictating to you. We're going to discuss what this looks like together. The next, it being a time-consuming event. Specifics can come into play here where we're working to try and streamline what is this going to look like for clear expectations. And then congruence, right? That we model that we're in alignment. We talk about efficiency here and setting clear expectations. Well, then we have to walk the talk. We have to follow through on it. The next one is around perceived impact on career progression. Congruence can come into play here. Again, establish a transparent process for promotions and then follow it. And then appreciation can be important here, right? Is to recognize people for what they're doing. Lastly, the 10th challenge that we talked about was a disconnect from the actual performance. This is where listening can be really important, right? Where we're soliciting input from the employees to ensure that we have a full understanding of all of the things that they've done, because maybe I have missed some things. And then lastly, specifics as it relates to that disconnect. Using objective, data-driven metrics to measure performance so that we minimize that chance of subjectivity, which really there's always going to be a chance that that's going to happen. After we've talked about the SCARF model in terms of the domains that might be impacted, and we've talked about behaviors around cables in terms of how we address those, the last piece that can be really valuable here is how do we help them manage performance. And one of the models that I use, again, that I mentioned, is the 4 disciplines of execution. And there are 4 strategies or disciplines that you use. And if you're interested, there is another podcast that I have that with Jim Hewling, who's one of the authors or co-authors of the book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution. We talk about this. But the first discipline is around focusing on what they call a wildly important goal, or otherwise a WIG. Now, it doesn't have to be a WIG, but you could certainly work this to identify 1 or 2 critical areas that you want to work on throughout the year, or you'd like to see them work on, or that you agree that are going to be worked on with the employee. So it's a collaborative approach there. The next is you focus on lead measures, the activities that are going to, if we do them consistently enough, are probably going to align with what that lag indicator is, the thing that we want. And that's an important distinction, right? Is that we're going to focus on the lead measures. The next thing that we're going to do, number 3, is we're going to keep a compelling scoreboard. And that's something that's going to be visible and we're going to agree to. I will tell you, in my office here, I actually have a glass whiteboard that my, 6 goals for the year are on there, and they're mapped out by month. That is my scoreboard. And that's what I look to see where am I on a regular basis. It's right in front of me. So I can't fool myself into thinking I'm somewhere that I'm not. And I think that's the important thing with it being visible and agreed upon. Next and last is creating a cadence of accountability. And this gets into that part about the frequency of when we're going to meet. I would challenge you to try and do laser check-ins once a week with individuals. And that could be 5 minutes of what did we agree to? What did you say you were going to do over the last week to advance closer to your goal? How are you doing? If they didn't get there, what got in the way? What are they going to do to make sure that that doesn't happen again this week? But when we do that, if we're just doing these 5-minute check-ins to see where we are, there's very little chance for us to get too far off track. We're not 3 months into this and all of a sudden we're having to backpedal to realize that we don't have the resources, tools, maybe we chose the wrong goal to be able to achieve. This gives us an opportunity in a very quick basis to figure out where we are. And then that turns this performance management process into something that is a living document that we work from. Now, if you're wondering more about this model, or you are interested more about the SCARF model or even cables, how to use it, to me, this is where, from an efficiency standpoint, I mentioned ChatGPT. As an example, I could take the 4 disciplines of execution. I could type into chat, I want to use the 4 disciplines of execution with this particular employee to set this performance management outline. Can you make suggestions as to how I could do that? And ChatGPT will outline that for you based on the 4 disciplines of execution based on this book. And then you could refine it based on the response back that you could get. You could say, could you help me, based on what we're doing, develop some strong lead measures based on the 4DX model? Or I could ask it, could you help me create a compelling scoreboard? That's where chat is able to do the work for you. Or I could say, I'm dealing with this employee right now, and this is the scenario. How is the SCARF model relevant to this particular situation? And it will outline potentially what are some of the challenges or domains that need to be addressed with this employee. And this is where ChatGPT can be so impactful in terms of you being able to lead more effectively, because you can almost use this as an assistant coach, as somebody that you can test your own thoughts in terms of helping you evaluate. I could ask it in regards to the cables model that I created. How do I make sure that the behaviors that I've mentioned here are more effective? What are some specific things that I could be doing right now with this situation based on cables that would allow for this relationship to become more effective? And it will do that. Again, if you haven't already, I would highly encourage you to sign up for chat and look for ways to start using it. I will be doing a follow-up webinar demonstrating how managers and leaders can improve their effectiveness as a leader by using chat. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So just to recap, we talked about 10 challenges that employees are facing. Then we talked about the social needs of SCARF and how those will play into those challenges, and identifying those is really important, because the next thing that we do is we look and say, what are the behaviors? What are those cables behaviors that can create a better outcome, a better bridge with the employee? And then lastly, one framework that I've identified for you is the 4DX model. How can you use this with your employees? Now, if there's another model that you want to use, you could, again, use ChatGPT, input that model, ask it a question about that model, and say, how would I use it with this employee to become more effective? I hope you found this podcast on performance management to be inspiring yourself. There's such an opportunity I think we have with performance reviews and the whole year-long process of managing performance in somebody else. Unfortunately, it's been a check-the-box exercise for too long, but there really is an opportunity to make this an incredibly powerful tool, and I hope you take that challenge and you have an opportunity to do that. If you have questions, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I always love getting DM'd by individuals on, questions or follow-up questions that they might have on this, and I'm happy to answer those. And until the next episode that we have together, I hope you're able to go out there and rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.